A pair of mangled boots, a disemboweled toy bear, and a bloody entrail in the snow. That's all that remained of Walter Abbott when he disappeared on January 5th, 1904. Only his younger brother, 7-year-old Ralph Abbott, saw what happened to Walter that fateful day. He survived this ordeal with a curved line scarred on his arm and plagued with nightmares of what he witnessed. Ralph didn't utter a word about what happened, the choice he subconsciously made to protect himself from the truth. It was decades later, on his deathbed, when he knew that this was his last chance to do so, that he finally shared this shocking tale of what happened to his older brother. We lived on a small farm outside Newfield, Maine. My mother, whose parents came from Austria, filled our heads with eerie tales from the old country, but Maine was quiet, with its own kind of quiet horror, especially in winter, when thick snow turned our isolated farm into an island of white. Getting to town meant trudging for miles through deep drifts, dragging sacks of food and supplies back through the bitter cold. But the day it happened, the snowstorm that had trapped us within our home for a full week finally passed, but the thick mound of snow remained. My mother, father, and older sister Betsy dressed in winter coats and boots and braved that frosty air to walk to town and get us supplies. With everyone needed to fetch supplies, it wasn't uncommon for us boys to stay behind and tend to the farm. I stayed behind with Walter, the remnants of the festive season surrounding us, but the grayness of the start of the new year unavoidable. The only reason Walt was chosen to stay over Betsy was because he had woken up coughing and feverish, and me, because given my age and short legs, I was seen as more of a hindrance than a help. I climbed onto the wooden table and I watched my family leave through the wooden framed window, using my shirt sleeve to wipe away the steam. And as they disappeared across the fields, only their snowy footprints left behind. I remember hoping that they would return swiftly so that my time with Walt would not be drawn out. The truth was, I didn't like my brother. He could be cruel and selfish. He reveled in making me squirm in ways feared by a young child. He once placed worms in my bed the day after wash day, knowing that I would have to endure the dirt and stench for the next 2 weeks. He stole food out of the pantry and left crumbs in my coat pocket so I would be blamed, and he delighted in giving me arm slaps and painful twists on my arm whenever Mother or Betsy weren't looking. Being just the two of us on this farm made me gulp back in fear. I knew he wasn't ill, and that this had been lies so that he would get to stay home. And as I heard his fake cough stop vibrating through the ceiling, and instead heard him stirring upstairs, I knew that I didn't have much time. I ran toward the pantry cupboard and I slid beneath the bottom shelf next to the bags of flour and the jars of preserves. I was cramped. That air was stagnant, but hours cooped up in there, and it was much more preferable to what would happen if Walter got his hands on me. I heard him creaking down the stairs and I dared to look through the small gap in the door. I could see him in the kitchen in his striped white shirt, a menacing look on his face as he searched the room. As he stared straight at that pantry, I stayed as still as a mouse and I held my breath. His eyes still seemed to bore into mine and I was certain he had seen me. I closed my eyes and I waited for the door to fling open and pain to follow. I heard his taunts. "I will find you, Ralphie. I will make your arm rage red from snake bites." As his words and footsteps muffled, I dared to look through the gap and to inhale a breath. He hadn't found me. He was leaving the room. Hours passed by in which Walter gave up looking for me and instead stomped in and out of the kitchen, trailing in snow and laughing to himself. I sat there, the cramp prickling at my legs, but too afraid to flinch in case Walt heard me. I tried to distract myself by daydreaming about spring days and the warmth returning. That's when this harsh ringing interrupted my thoughts. It was a loud, shrill ringing that caused the pantry door to shake. I cautiously stared through the gap and I saw Walter climb onto the wooden table and stare out of the window. I could tell from his heavy grunts and the way that he thudded back onto his feet that whatever he had seen had riled him. "I know this is your doing, Ralphie. I will make you pay for this," he shouted as he marched out of the room. I didn't know what was happening, but I heard these bells. I stared at the kitchen, my heart thudding so loudly I was sure Walter would be able to hear it even over the bells. I heard the clattering sounds first. It was a mixture of tumbling furniture, wails, and those heavy rattling bells. I stared through the gap, knowing in my gut something bad was happening to Walter, but waiting to see what it was. I didn't have to wait much longer. Walter staggered into the kitchen, his hand clutched to his stomach and a look of terror on his face. He clung to the kitchen table, collapsing onto it and causing it to creak beneath his weight. He was sobbing and shouting, "Stop, please stop." I was just a little kid. I didn't know what to do other than stay hidden and watch. They stepped into the room with heavy footsteps, a metal cowbell clutched in their gloved hand. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could see that they were a towering presence. This long hooded white fur coat and the white porcelain mask covering their face. The air seemed to turn cold as I watched them loom over Walter, the brass cowbell raised in their gloved hand. They seemed to stay still for seconds, for minutes. I'm not sure how long. Time seemed to stop. As Walter collided with the hard floor, that masked figure slowly rang the bell, and I saw Walter's bloody hands as he dragged his injured body across the floor. As he wriggled and he squirmed, that figure rang the bell. I held my breath again and I looked at him, even though the voice in my head was screaming at me to look away. His eyes seeked out that gap, and this time there was no doubt in my mind that he saw me. He lifted a bloody hand and he mouthed the words, "Help me." As the masked figure moved behind him, this dragging sound followed. I saw their right leg, grotesquely swollen, at least 3 times the size of the other leg, beneath the white trimmed fur boot that covered it. They rang that cowbell, a sound that echoed through my skin. And then with one hand, they grabbed Walter's leg and they pulled him across the floor. I will always remember that look of fear in his eyes, his body thudding across the floor and his hand scraping at the floor to try and keep himself in place. That was the last time I ever saw Walter again, but the look of fear and the contempt for me, his brother, who watched on and did nothing, has forever stained my mind. I stayed in the pantry, shaken and whimpering in fear, unable to make sense of it as I buried my head in my hands. The creaks outside caused my ears to prick up. I was terrified and I couldn't bring myself to look through that gap, not until it was too late. Something covered the gap, immersing me in darkness, and I heard my staggered breaths and I thought I was about to meet the same fate as Walter. The door creaked open and I saw them hunched over, their head tilted to the side. The gaps beneath the porcelain mask focused on me. They were an imposing figure, especially through my young eyes. I could see the blood splattered across their fur coat, glistening in its freshness, blood that hadn't been there before. I couldn't help but look at their enlarged leg that seemed to throb against the floor, pulsing beneath the fur boot binding as if it had its own heartbeat. They put a gloved finger to the ice-white lips of their mask and then reached out a long arm, bits of blood splattering off the fur and onto me. I couldn't move. The fear was paralyzing. I couldn't even close my eyes. I just stared at that monstrous figure in front of me. It was as they pulled the glove off their one hand that I realized that they were no longer holding that cowbell. I didn't have time to think any more about this as their hand came into view, withered, Saggy, gray skin hung limply from bony fingers, and their fingernails black and brittle. And they reached this deformed hand out and they traced a sharp fingernail along my forearm. A numbness there as they did this. They pulled their arm away and there was a moment of nothing. And then they stood up and they walked away, dragging their deformed leg behind them. I stayed there, still and unmoving as I watched them leave. I don't know when I found the strength to move, only that I somehow managed to make it over to the window. Kneeling on the wooden table, I stared out and I almost fell back in fright. A horrifying snowman was directly in front of the window. Crossed sticks as eyes, and what looked like human teeth pushed place to form a zigzagged mouth, and my brother's mangled boots protruding at angles from its frosty head. I crawled back into the pantry, shaking as I cowered there. I could hear the bell chimes ringing out around me, growing quieter and quieter until I could no longer hear them at all. I heard my parents gasping in horror and then calling my name, but I thought it was that monstrous figure tricking me. So I closed my eyes and I stayed as still as I could. I felt someone grab me. I opened my eyes and I saw Betsy's chestnut eyes staring at me, but I found it hard to believe that it was truly her. I shook and I trembled within her hold, unable to utter a word of the terror I had witnessed. She tapped her fingertips to my forearm and with a sharp burst of pain pierced through it. It was unimaginable. I looked at my arm in disbelief. There was a curved line cut into my skin, about 7 inches long, that had marked itself through my shirt, icy frost like whitish blue, and had also been numb from pain. And as Betsy led me out of that pantry, I saw the destruction for myself. The broken furniture, the deranged snowman that I'm sure Walter had seen too and blamed me for, and the trail of red in the snow that led toward the snow-lined tree. A trail seeped in blood and lumpy pinkish things, innards of something. Innards of my brother? I wanted to tell them what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. Who would believe something so terrible? And there was more. Later that night, as my stoic father carried me into the room I shared with Walter, what we saw caused my father to fall on his knees, still clutching onto me as he fell. My teddy bear, the one Walter had taken from me months ago, was placed on his pillow, all of its stuffing pulled out and sprawled across the woven blanket. And in its place was this long, coiled, bloodied thing that had been stuffed into the bear, part of it bursting out. It was rancid and snake-like. I didn't know what they were at the time, but I think I know now. Intestines. I don't know if they were Walter's or an animal's, but they were real. That figure in the mask had done it, but I don't know why. They had come from the snow in a fury and left a deathly chill in their wake. They had taken Walter but left me behind, forced to wear this curved scar for the rest of my life, a reminder so that I could never forget. It was true that I never cared much for Walter. He could be wicked and vicious, but he was still my brother. This guilt eats away at me, and everyone needs to know that it wasn't a wild animal that did that to him, but something else. Something that I saw with my own eyes. A fury out of the snow. The snow fury. At the time, it was presumed that Walter had been taken by a bear or a lynx, and the intestines found in the toy bear were passed off as a joke played by Walter on his brother. A joke that, on reflection, would make no sense for Walter to have carried out on his own bed. But Ralph Abbott stayed silent until the 1950s, when on his deathbed, he knew this would be his last time to speak of it, so he told this story to his children. There have been various reports of masked intruders over the years, but it is uncertain if any of these are connected to the ominous figure that took Walter Abbott, a figure that Ralph referred to as the Snow Fury. However, Ralph's story shares some similarities with the folklore of Frau Perchta, dubbed the Christmas Witch, who between Christmas and Epiphany is believed to step out of the snowy mountains to punish misbehaved children by slitting their bellies and replacing them with trash. She is also known to have one leg of great disproportion to the other. Although Frau Perchta isn't noted to have a cowbell or a mask, the similarities outweigh the variations. For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.